The year was 1868, and Tennessee was still bleeding from the wounds of the Civil War. Farms were burned, families scattered, and the air in the Appalachian foothills carried both the silence of mourning and the roar of survival. Among those struggling to rebuild was the Collins family, a sprawling clan with deep roots in the ridges outside Carter County. The Collinses had once been prosperous. Before the war, they owned acres of fertile land, raised cattle, and traded lumber with neighbors. But with the conflict came devastation. Union and Confederate soldiers alike stripped their fields, burned their barns, and left them destitute. Worse still, several of the family's strongest men never returned from the battlefield. When the smoke cleared, the clan was a shadow of its former self. It was in this fragile moment that the elders of the Collins family gathered in their ancestral home, a log structure perched on a hill overlooking their wasted fields. There were 6 of them, gray-haired men and women who believed survival meant clinging to tradition. They feared that, with their wealth gone and their reputation bruised, outsiders would prey upon their daughters, seize their land through marriage, or dilute the bloodline they had carried proudly for generations. And so, on a stormy autumn night, they made a pact. They vowed that the Collins bloodline would remain pure. Their daughters and sons would marry only within distant branches of their own kin, never outsiders. Their land would remain theirs, passed down intact through careful union and controlled inheritance. The pact was sealed not on paper, but in spoken word, witnessed by the firelight, and etched into the hearts of every Collins present. At first, this decision appeared wise. Neighboring families had been destroyed entirely, their land carved up and sold to strangers. The Collinses, however, tightened their circle. Cousins married cousins. Brothers built cabins near sisters. The land was not only preserved but fortified, for no outside suitor could stake a claim. By 1875, the Collins name was once again spoken with respect in the hills. They were survivors, people said, resilient, determined, bound together like stone walls against the storm. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent success was the seed of tragedy. The pact created a fortress, yes, but also a prison. Young men and women were denied the freedom to love beyond the clan. Those who dared were branded as traitors, their names whispered like curses. A girl who fell for a merchant in town was sent away in shame. A boy who longed to enlist in the railroad work crews was told his duty was to keep the blood alive. The family justified every cruelty with the same phrase, the pact must hold, and hold it did for a time. The first children born of cousin unions seemed healthy enough, though some were frailer than expected. The elders dismissed this, insisting their choices were righteous. Better a weak Collins than no Collins at all, they said. But as years passed, more signs emerged. Infants with twisted limbs, children who could not speak or walk, small graves dug quietly behind the homestead, marked only with stones, as if to erase the evidence of what the pact had begun to cost. Still, the elders clung to their vow. Shame drove them deeper into secrecy. They explained the deaths as illness, the deformities as God's testing. To outsiders, the Collins family appeared proud and united. But within their cabins, whispers of fear began to grow louder. Mothers cried alone in the night, holding children who would never live normal lives. Fathers drank heavily, torn between loyalty to the pact and guilt for the pain it brought. What had begun as an act of survival was quietly transforming into a curse. The tragedy of the Collins Pact lies not only in the suffering it created, but in the blindness it fostered. The family could not see that survival does not come from walls, but from bridges. They mistook control for strength, when in truth, their strength had always been in resilience, adaptability, and openness to change. By closing their bloodline to the outside world, they shut themselves off from fresh ideas, new alliances, and healthier futures. And yet it is easy to understand why they did it. In 1868, fear ruled the hills. Families had seen everything they knew stripped away by war. In such times, the instinct to cling tighter to what little remained is natural. The Collinses were not monsters. They were human beings, making choices they thought would save their children. Their tragedy was that those choices, born of desperation, became shackles for generations to come. The Pact of 1868 stands as a reminder of the dangerous line between preservation and obsession. Protecting family, heritage, and identity is noble, but when that protection becomes isolation, when it sacrifices compassion, freedom, and love, it rots from within. The Collins family learned this too late. Their nursery of suffering children was not only a biological consequence of their pact, but also a spiritual one, born from secrecy and silence. For us today, their story offers a warning wrapped in history. How often do we cling too tightly to old ways, out of fear of losing what we know? How often do we mistake control for strength? The Collins elders believed they were preserving their family, but in truth, they were suffocating it. Survival in any age, whether after a war or in modern times, requires courage, yes, but also humility, the courage to open doors and the humility to accept help, love, and change. The Collins Pact of 1868 was made in firelight and fear, but its echoes stretch beyond Tennessee's hills. It asks us, even now, to examine our own lives and communities. Are we guarding traditions that uplift, or clinging to ones that harm? Are we building legacies of compassion, or prisons of pride? The Collinses remind us that family is not preserved by walls of secrecy, but by bridges of truth. By the late 1870s, the Collins clan of Tennessee was no longer seen as a broken family left in ruin by the Civil War. Outwardly, they had rebuilt themselves. Their land stretched green again, their homes were standing tall, and their name carried weight in the ridges of Carter County. To neighbors, the Collinses were survivors, united, prosperous, and bound together by discipline. But behind the timber walls of their cabins, the cost of their 1868 pact was beginning to reveal itself in ways that no wealth or pride could cover. The first signs appeared subtle, so much so that the elders ignored them. A baby was born smaller than expected, fragile as a bird. A toddler had trouble walking, his steps uncertain and slow. A young girl spoke later than her peers, and when she finally found her voice, her words came slurred, difficult to understand. To the Collinses, these were not warnings but challenges to be endured. They told themselves such things were common among mountain families. Hardship was the soil of their existence, and surely the children would outgrow these troubles, but they did not. By the 1880s, the effects of the Bloodline Pact grew impossible to deny. Cousins marrying cousins, year after year, generation after generation, began to leave visible marks on the children. Some were born with twisted spines, others with cleft palates or unusual facial structures that made strangers whisper when they passed through town. A few were born blind, their milky eyes staring into nothing, and then there were the children who did not live long at all, taken by sickness or frailty before they reached their first birthday. For every healthy child born, there seemed to be another who carried the shadow of the pact. The Collins family responded in the only way they knew, secrecy. The elders declared that what happened inside the family must remain there. Babies born too weak were kept indoors, away from neighbors' eyes. The mothers were told not to cry in public, lest outsiders catch wind of their sorrow. The community began to suspect, of course. Rumors spread of a haunted nursery in the Collins homestead, a room where children cried but were never seen. The family neither confirmed nor denied such talk. Instead, they doubled down on their pact, insisting that to abandon it would be to betray their ancestors and risk losing everything once again. This secrecy carried a heavy toll on the women of the family. Many became mothers not of joy but of dread. Each pregnancy brought anxiety, each birth a gamble between hope and heartbreak. When a healthy child arrived, it was celebrated quietly, as though speaking too loudly of good fortune might invite misfortune. But when a deformed or disabled child was born, the mother's heart was often broken twice, once by the suffering of her baby, and again by the pressure to hide that suffering from the world. Fathers, too, bore their burdens in silence. Some drowned their guilt in drink, others in anger. They wanted strong sons to work the fields, yet too often were given sons who could not even stand. A few fathers, consumed by shame, distanced themselves from their children, treating them as curses rather than blessings. But others, despite the pressure of the pact, chose to love fiercely, holding their disabled children as though their weakness only made them more precious. The generational consequences of the pact were not only physical but emotional and spiritual. Resentment brewed within the younger Collinses. They began to question the wisdom of the elders. "Why must I marry my cousin?" One young man asked. "Why must I live in this valley forever when the world is so wide?" These questions, however, were met with stern silence or outright punishment. To challenge the pact was to challenge the very foundation of the clan's identity, and yet rebellion flickered in secret. A few brave souls slipped away. One girl ran off with a traveling preacher, another with a railroad worker passing through town. Their names were stricken from family records, their faces erased from memory, as though they had never been born. The Collinses thought this erasure preserved their strength, but in truth, it only deepened the fractures within. Every silenced child, every erased daughter, every hidden grave, it all compounded into a legacy of pain. What makes this chapter of the Collins story especially haunting is not just the physical deformities, but the moral blindness that allowed them to continue. The family chose pride over compassion, secrecy over honesty, and tradition over truth. Instead of seeking medical help, instead of learning from their suffering, they insisted on silence, and in that silence, suffering multiplied. But hidden within this darkness was also a spark of resilience. Some of the children, though disabled, grew into remarkable individuals. One boy, born with a twisted leg, became known for his gift of storytelling, captivating neighbors with tales around the fire. A girl, unable to speak clearly, expressed herself through weaving, creating patterns that amazed those who saw them. Though the pact tried to bury them in shame, these children found ways to shine. Their existence whispered a quiet truth, that worth is not measured by physical perfection but by the spirit within. As the 19th century turned toward the 20th, the Collins clan faced a reckoning. The generational consequences could no longer be dismissed as bad luck or God's will. Too many graves lined their fields, too many mothers wept in silence. A few members of the younger generation began to speak openly, though at great risk, about breaking the pact. They argued that true survival meant adaptation, not stubbornness, that to cling to the past was to doom the future. In the broader history of Tennessee, the Collins family became a whispered cautionary tale, a living example of how isolation and pride could corrode even the strongest legacy. Their story spread not through newspapers but through word of mouth, neighbors warning one another not to repeat their mistakes. And for us today, the generational consequences of the Collins Pact remain a lesson in courage. We inherit not only land or names from our ancestors, but also their choices, their fears, and their mistakes. The Collinses teach us that every generation must decide whether to repeat the errors of the past or to break free from them. Their suffering reminds us that silence and secrecy never heal. Only truth and openness can. The Collins family paid dearly for their pact. But their story survives not as a condemnation alone, but as a motivation to choose wisely what we pass to the next generation, and to remember that love and openness are the truest legacies we can leave behind. By the mid-1880s, the Collins family homestead in eastern Tennessee carried a secret so heavy that even the mountain winds seemed to whisper about it. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of strange cries heard at night, muffled sobs that drifted down from the Collins Ridge. Children dared each other to wander near the property, only to flee at the first creak of wood or rustle of leaves. Behind the sturdy walls of the Collins cabin was what came to be known, though never officially named, as the Unspeakable Nursery. This nursery was not a place of joy decorated with toys and laughter. It was a room of shadows, tucked into the back of the main house, away from the windows where curious eyes might look in. Here, the Collins clan hid the children born with the marks of their bloodline pact. Deformed, frail, or afflicted with illnesses the family did not understand, these little ones were kept out of sight, as though hiding them might also hide the truth of the pact's consequences. The room itself was sparse, wooden cribs built by the fathers, quilts stitched by weary mothers, and the faint smell of herbs hung in bundles from the rafters, meant to ward off sickness. Yet no herbs, no whispered prayers could erase the reality. The nursery was filled not with the cheerful songs of infants, but with quiet suffering, groans, gasps, and sometimes silence that lasted too long. Mothers sat in rocking chairs through endless nights, holding babies who struggled to breathe, rocking children who would never walk. The weight of their grief was doubled by the command of secrecy. They could not cry out, could not seek comfort from neighbors, could not even hold proper funerals when the little ones passed. Instead, small graves were dug on the family's land, marked with uncarved stones, their stories buried as deeply as their bodies. What made the nursery so unspeakable was not only the presence of deformed children, but the silence demanded around them. Within the family, these children were simultaneously loved and shunned. Loved because they were flesh and blood, shunned because they were constant reminders of the pact and its price. To speak of them too openly was to question the elders' wisdom, and that was forbidden. Thus, the nursery became both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where mothers clung desperately to hope, even as fathers avoided the room altogether. Neighbors noticed the secrecy. When Collins women stopped bringing their babies to church, when children vanished from view after infancy, questions arose. Some speculated that the Collinses practiced strange rituals, others believed they were cursed. But no outsider ever entered the nursery. The Collinses guarded it fiercely, their silence both a shield and a chain. As years passed, the nursery grew to hold more than just infants. Some children, though disabled, lived into childhood, requiring constant care. A boy with twisted legs spent most of his days crawling across the wooden floor, smiling when his mother sang but crying whenever footsteps approached the door. A girl born without the ability to speak learned to hum tuneless melodies, filling the room with ghostly echoes. These children developed their own small world, bound together by their shared exile. They were hidden from society, but within the nursery, they formed bonds stronger than their parents realized. Yet the nursery also carried a darker shadow, neglect. Not all Collins adults had the strength or compassion to face the suffering within. Some fathers, ashamed of their children, refused to acknowledge them. A few mothers, overwhelmed by exhaustion and fear, withdrew emotionally, leaving the children to the care of grandmothers or older siblings. In this way, the nursery became not only a place of hidden life, but also of forgotten life. The walls absorbed the loneliness of children who longed for love they rarely received. Despite this, the unspeakable nursery was not without flickers of light. A few of the women, particularly younger mothers, poured their whole hearts into those children. They taught them to weave, to hum, to carve small figures from wood. They saw in them not deformities but souls, souls worth nurturing, even if the world never saw them. These small acts of tenderness became quiet rebellions against the pact, proof that love could still exist even in the midst of secrecy and shame. The tragedy of the nursery was not only in the suffering of the children, but in the wasted potential of the family itself. By locking away those they considered unfit, the Collinses robbed themselves of the lessons compassion could have taught them, and of the richness diversity brings to a community. The nursery became a mirror reflecting the family's fear, pride, and refusal to confront truth. Over time, whispers of the nursery reached beyond the hills. Travelers spoke of the house of hidden children, of shadows moving behind shuttered windows. The Collinses denied everything, but the rumors persisted. The secrecy intended to protect the family's name instead stained it with mystery and suspicion. The unspeakable nursery became a legend in Tennessee, told with both fear and pity, a symbol of what happens when pride outweighs humanity. Yet within this darkness lies a lesson for us today. The Collins family teaches that secrecy magnifies suffering. By hiding their children, they denied them the dignity of being seen, the chance to be loved by a wider world. They also denied themselves the healing that honesty could have brought. To speak openly of struggle is not weakness, it is strength. To acknowledge imperfection is not shame, it is courage. The unspeakable nursery, though tragic, becomes a powerful metaphor. Every family, every community has its hidden rooms, secrets, struggles, or pains we lock away out of fear of judgment. The Collinses show us the danger of such silence. What is hidden festers, what is silenced grows heavier. Only when we open the door, speak the truth, and let light into the nursery of our lives can healing begin. The children of the Collins clan, though silenced in their time, still speak to us now. They remind us that worth is not measured by perfection, and that hiding pain only multiplies it. Their story motivates us to break cycles of secrecy and to choose compassion over pride. The unspeakable nursery may have been built of wood and shadows in 19th century Tennessee, but its echo is timeless. It asks us one simple question: what doors in our lives are we afraid to open? By the dawn of the 1890s, the Collins clan's ridge in Carter County had grown into a fortress of secrecy. Their pact of 1868 had carried them through famine and hardship, but it had also cursed them with the hidden sorrow of the nursery. For 2 decades, the family had kept its silence, convinced that pride and bloodline meant more than compassion and truth. But silence, like water behind a dam, cannot hold forever. Cracks will form, pressure will build, and eventually something or someone will break. That someone was Martha Collins. Martha was not the first woman of the family to suffer under the pact, but she was the first to refuse its weight. Born in 1869, she was the granddaughter of one of the original 6 elders who swore the pact into being. She grew up in the shadow of the nursery, hearing the cries of cousins she was told never to speak of. As a child, she remembered sneaking to the nursery door, peeking through the crack to see the children hidden inside. She never forgot the sight of one boy, her age, who could not walk, smiling at her with an innocence that belied the secrecy around him. That memory etched into her heart a question the elders could never silence: why must love be hidden? When Martha came of age, she was married, predictably, to a distant cousin. By then, she had already begun to question the pact, but her voice was drowned out by tradition. Her husband, though not cruel, was loyal to the elders and unwilling to challenge the family's ways. For years, Martha carried her doubts in silence. She obeyed, but her eyes saw what others ignored: the toll of secrecy on the women, the graves behind the homestead, and the haunted faces of mothers forced to bury children without names. In 1888, Martha gave birth to her first child, a girl named Clara. To her relief, the baby was healthy, with bright eyes and a strong cry. But 2 years later, when her second child was born, Martha faced the truth of the pact in the most personal way. Her son, Thomas, came into the world frail and malformed. His chest was sunken, his limbs thin and twisted. The elders told her at once what must be done. Thomas would be placed in the nursery, away from sight, away from the world. But Martha could not obey. She held her son in her arms, fragile as he was, and saw not a curse but a child. His tiny fingers curled around hers, his eyes searching hers as though begging her not to let him vanish into shadows. Martha wept not for his weakness, but for the cruelty of a pact that would condemn him to silence before he had even lived. For the first time in her life, she felt the full injustice of the family's choices press against her, like a weight she could no longer carry. When Thomas was 2 weeks old, Martha did the unthinkable. She left the Collins Ridge. Wrapping her baby in a quilt, she set out before dawn, walking the dirt road toward Knoxville. Her husband begged her to reconsider, warning her that she would be branded a traitor, that the family would cut her off forever. But Martha's resolve was unshakable. If being a Collins means hiding my child, she told him, then I will no longer be a Collins. The journey to Knoxville was grueling. Martha walked miles with her newborn, relying on the kindness of strangers for food and shelter. Each step was a rebellion against generations of silence. When she finally reached the city, she sought out a physician, a rarity for mountain families in those days. The doctor examined Thomas carefully, explaining that while his condition was serious, he could still live a meaningful life with care. For Martha, those words were like a window thrown open in a dark room. For the first time, someone spoke of her son not as a curse, but as a person worthy of dignity. News of Martha's act spread quickly back to Carter County. Some in the clan were outraged, calling her reckless, even sinful. The elders declared her disloyal, warning others not to follow her example. But their anger could not erase the fact that Martha had broken the silence. Her defiance planted seeds of doubt in the hearts of the younger Collinses. If Martha could defy the pact and still find hope, then perhaps the pact was not unbreakable after all. Martha's choice did not erase the suffering of the nursery, nor did it dismantle the pact overnight. But it marked the beginning of its unraveling. Families are not undone in a single day. They unravel thread by thread, moment by moment. Martha was that first thread pulled loose by courage. Others soon followed, quietly at first, then with growing boldness. Her act also changed the way the community saw the Collinses. For decades, they had been viewed as proud but secretive, their legacy whispered with suspicion. Now, neighbors spoke of Martha as a woman of rare bravery. She had walked away from land, wealth, and reputation for the sake of her child. In doing so, she reminded others that love must always come before tradition, and compassion before pride. The breaking point of the Collins clan was not marked by fire or violence, but by something far more powerful, the courage of a mother who chose truth over silence. Martha's defiance carried a message that would echo through generations. Secrecy cannot heal, and tradition without compassion becomes tyranny. For us today, Martha's story is a reminder that cycles of suffering are broken not by silence, but by those willing to speak, act, and endure the cost of change. The Collins clan clung to their pact for 20 years, but it took only one woman's choice to show a better path. Her breaking point became the family's turning point, and a lesson for us all. When the story of Martha Collins spread through Carter County, it shook the silence of the Collins clan like a bell in the mountains. For the first time in decades, someone had stood against the 1,168 pact, not with violence, but with courage and truth. Though the elders condemned her, and though some of her kin swore never to speak her name again, Martha's defiance forced a question that could no longer be ignored. What has our suffering taught us? The Collins family had endured nearly 30 years under the pact. In that time, they had seen both survival and sorrow. Their land was intact, their name preserved, but their children, the most innocent among them, had paid the highest price. The graves behind the homestead told the real story, row after row of small, unmarked stones. These stones, though silent, carried a lesson heavier than any sermon. Pride could preserve land, but it could not preserve life. Tradition could guard a name, but it could not guarantee joy. The suffering of the Collins children began to change the hearts of the younger generation. They could not ignore the cries that had filled the nursery, nor the weary faces of their mothers. They had grown up watching secrets rot the family from within. While the elders clung to the pact as a symbol of strength, the youth began to see it as a chain. Slowly, a quiet rebellion stirred, not in the form of shouted defiance, but in whispered conversations and hidden acts of compassion. One young man, Elias Collins, remembered sneaking food and toys into the nursery for his disabled cousins, even though he was forbidden to acknowledge them. When he grew older, he married outside the clan, not loudly, not proudly, but in quiet defiance. Others followed his example, slipping away from the ridge to build lives in neighboring towns. Though their names were scratched from family records, they carried with them the lesson Martha had lived. Love and dignity mattered more than blind loyalty. Even within the clan, some began to soften. A few mothers who had once obeyed the elders' commands to hide their children now insisted on bringing them to church. Though whispers followed them down the aisle, these mothers held their heads high. They had learned, through loss and grief, that shame only deepened wounds. Better, they decided, to face whispers in public than to suffer alone in silence. Suffering also forced the Collins clan to look outward. When Martha took her child to a doctor in Knoxville, she shattered the belief that outsiders could not be trusted. Her courage showed that help often came from beyond one's own walls. Slowly, others began to seek medical advice, to ask questions about health and heredity, though many still did so in secret. The very act of reaching outward, however small, was a lesson in humility. Survival did not mean isolation, it meant connection. The story of the Collins clan's suffering began to ripple beyond their ridge. Neighbors, once quick to whisper curses about Collins' blood, began to pity the family. Some even offered help, bringing food, offering prayers, or extending friendship to children once hidden away. For generations, the pact had isolated the Collinses, but suffering began to build bridges where pride had built walls. The community, too, learned from their pain that judgment only deepens wounds and compassion is the only soil in which healing can grow. The greatest lesson, however, came not from the adults but from the children themselves. Many of those hidden in the nursery lived short lives, but the ones who survived taught their families more than any elder's sermon. One boy, unable to walk, learned to carve wood with his hands, leaving behind delicate figures of birds and animals. His work, admired by neighbors, became a symbol of beauty born from struggle. A girl with a speech impediment grew into a gifted singer, her stammer vanishing when she sang hymns in church. These children, once seen as burdens, became living proof that worth is never determined by perfection. Their lives carried a truth the Collins elders had long ignored. Suffering can crush a spirit, but it can also reveal resilience. In their laughter, their creativity, and their determination to live despite their challenges, the Collins children taught their family that dignity does not depend on physical strength or social approval. It depends on love, acceptance, and the refusal to let shame define a life. By the turn of the 20th century, the Collins clan was no longer the same. The pact had lost its absolute power, though traces of its influence lingered. Some still clung to secrecy, still feared outsiders, still whispered curses about betrayal, but others, many others, chose a different path. They had learned through decades of loss that suffering without reflection is wasted, but suffering embraced with honesty can lead to wisdom. The Collins story became a warning told in local lore, a tale of how pride can poison, how silence can destroy, and how generations can suffer when fear guides choices. Yet it also became a lesson in redemption. Though scarred, though haunted, the family was not destroyed. Martha's defiance, the children's resilience, and the mother's quiet courage planted seeds of change that grew slowly, quietly, into something stronger than the pact itself. For us today, the Collins family's suffering holds timeless lessons. Every family, every community faces struggles. Some we inherit, some we create, some we cannot control. What matters most is not the suffering itself, but how we respond to it. Do we hide it in shame, locking it away in our own unspeakable nurseries? Or do we face it with honesty, compassion, and courage, turning pain into wisdom? The Collinses remind us that secrecy magnifies pain, but truth brings healing. They show us that traditions must bend to compassion, or else they break under the weight of their own cruelty. And above all, they teach that every child, no matter how frail, deformed, or different, carries a dignity that no pact, no secrecy, no tradition has the right to deny. The lessons of their suffering echo across time, urging us to choose love over pride, openness over silence, and courage over fear. In the end, the Collins legacy is not the pact they made in 1868, but the wisdom carved out of their suffering, that true strength is not found in bloodlines, but in compassion.